All right, we're live. Welcome. It is Friday morning at 9:02, and we're here in general and housing to take some testimony from Austin Davis from the Lake Champlain Chamber on H-132, which is a bill that which is our homeless Bill of Rights. This is a bill I know that we've been tracking, and this we've had Austin or his predecessors into the committee on this bill in years past when we had testimony on this earlier this week. We asked Austin it was okay if we could bump him from that particular day, and he agreed graciously, and he's here this morning. So Austin, please join us. And so we know you're well aware of the bill and in general, but just the idea, there's two halves to this bill. There's the Bill of Rights portion, which are it's not standard because there are no Bill of Rights that exist like this in our statutes. And then the second half is about adding unhoused status to protected classes in many different discrimination categories. And those are two, while they are complementary, they're still two different things. So we want to give you the opportunity to talk about how the Lake Champlain's Chamber, Lake Champlain Chamber's view on the bill.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for the record, Austin Davis, Director of Government Affairs with the Lake Champlain Chamber. Thanks for this opportunity to come back and speak with you again on this. I think I've spoken about this about 4 or 5 times now in my tenure. I think not much has really changed in that time, other than the fact that things are a little bit more bleak in our communities. And I think we're of the mind that this is certainly the wrong time and sends the wrong message to be passing this bill, more so than ever. It could paint with a broad brush and could create stigma and make what already are really difficult circumstances in our communities more difficult. Driving a wedge between folks in our community who are housed and folks who are unhoused, unfortunately. I was saying last year in this committee when I testified that legislation such as this serves a purpose in our state that is not necessarily achieved by its passage. We see this legislation as an important moment to have a conversation about individuals in our community who are less fortunate and less privileged. However, we don't think that this is the right way to protect those folks. We're in the midst of a housing crisis that affects every Vermonter of every socioeconomic class, especially these folks. And we didn't get here overnight. It's because of decisions made at every level of government and that have choked the supply of housing. I mean, put most simply, homelessness is a housing problem, and we'd rather see the legislature and encourage the legislature to expend finite capacity on housing those experienced with homelessness by pulling back on the legacy of discriminatory land use policy and not create this legislation. It sends the wrong message to the public to pass this legislation. We have folks expressing frustration about our current crisis. It tells communities who are frustrated with the current crisis that they have to see members of our community sleeping on the streets and feel like their collective humanity is being eroded. It sends the message to them that, we're not going to find these people housing, and we're just going to give you a long-term framework to deal with it. While at the same time, creating some fear for folks when they're interacting with homeless populations, which already frankly have some fear, but it creates additional fear as folks are worried they might be subjected to some kind of private right of action. I just read in Digger this morning that there are 60 families being turned away from DCF shelters daily. We're in the midst of a full-blown crisis, and we'd rather not legalize tents. We'd rather legalize housing, and we'd rather spend time in this building focused on how to build that housing, how to fund transitional housing, how to help people, get out of these difficult circumstances. I've sent a number of you, some of the work we did over the summer, pulling large frameworks together. I don't think I've ever seen business organizations and organized labor signed on to a 5-page document such as that. And, you know, we think there are plenty of other things to do other than this. I think if we get, you know, really deeper into the bill, the crux of the matter is the vaguely defined activities associated with being homeless. And that's what's creating the most agita and hesitation within my membership. You know, I think we painted a legislation or testimony on this legislation has in the past kind of painted a picture of it being not necessary. And some folks kind of pointed it to being more important as being symbolic. However, the unintended consequences of this are just more fear and trepidation with folks who need to interact with this population. You know, we don't want to criminalize homelessness, and we don't want to see discrimination against homeless individuals in our communities. However, this is not an efficacious solution. You know, we applaud your intent. We just ask you to focus your energies elsewhere. You know, I think last year I talked to you folks about how this could apply to certain situations and in the context of our concerns around Section 2A1, which affords the ability of individuals with, you know, this temporal status to move and use freely in public spaces, including public sidewalks, parks, transportation, buildings in the narrow same manner as others would and without discrimination, combined with the vague activities associated with that are associated with homelessness. You know, we're kind of wondering, you know, what these activities are because it's not prescriptive, it's very vague. What's the threshold for harmless and you know, what is the disparate treatment? You know, we look at these in the community, there's different perspectives around what are activities associated with being homeless. And without defining it, you just open you know, the floodgate for folks to start defining it for themselves. And certainly, I think, you know, you'll find plenty of eager trial lawyers in the state who will want to pick up cases and bring that private right of action on behalf of individuals to fill in the gray fuzzy lines where you folks left off. That's going to create a lot of fear, as I said. That's going to create a lot of aggravation. And I don't think it's the best way to help this population. Maybe some trial lawyers who want to land some big settlements, get a couple, you know, victory notches, but certainly not the population we're looking to help. You know, I think we look at places of public accommodation, really that encompasses almost any place in the state. It's almost easier to identify what's not a place of public accommodation than to identify what is. And I think, you know, that means many of you either work jobs or have work jobs where you would be in that place of public accommodation. And just think about how difficult it is already to deal with individuals who are unhoused if they are participating in what you might associate as harmless activities associated with being homeless. You know, it's already difficult because oftentimes in our community, we're seeing homelessness is being seen along with other failures of our broader systems, such as mental health issues or public or, you know, substance misuse disorder. And it's already hard for businesses. I was talking to one person on my team this week. They were telling me about how a business in Burlington wanted to host de-escalation training for their employees to deal with this population. As I said, this population that sometimes is also, you know, co-presenting with other issues that are failures of our system. And they did this with the best intentions, and what they got in their de-escalation training was, you know what? Because so many things are being co-presented right now, we don't de-escalate, don't be a hero. You should call the designated agency or the police. And they said, well, frankly, when we try to call, we can't get these people. That's why we want to do the de-escalation training. So they're in a lose-lose situation. And now if you inject on top of this, the idea that if they don't handle this situation perfectly well, they can deal with a private right of action. It's going to be a lot of frustration. It's going to send the wrong message to community members that are trying to do the best they can in a very difficult environment. I think we talked about last year, the idea of perceived homelessness having massive unintended consequences, in which, to put it most bluntly, you could have individuals who are actually not unhoused writing what the definition of activities associated with homelessness are because of that perceived status. Many individuals in our downtowns are actually perceived, are creating trouble, everybody knows them, and they'll spend time, say, like in our parks or loitering outside of businesses. And, they will create issues and folks will assume that they're homeless. And the fact of the matter is they're not. A lot of the folks who are homeless are working very hard to survive and they're keeping to themselves mostly. But there's that perception. So what you're saying here with this legislation is this individual, because they're perceived homeless, because of these other co-presenting factors that combine with the general public stigma around what homelessness looks like, these individuals can seek remedy under this and then define in case law what being homeless actually means. I don't think that's what you intend to do with this, and I would caution you away from that. I think, like I said, I've gone through this a couple of times with you folks. I've provided testimony in the past. I think you get the gist. I know you have a lack of time and kind of a lack of committee members here. I think I just open it for questions or discussion.
So the point of anti-discrimination law is to acknowledge that discrimination exists. And to say that you cannot discriminate for any one particular purpose. So get away from my store, get out of my store because you're homeless. If they've been there for a couple hours versus telling somebody who's a college student who's not homeless, who's sitting there taking up a table for 2 hours on a computer. That's a very black and white version of discrimination. I'm just curious, like you said something about stigma. And I would love for you to go back into that, how defining this in this way would actually work against the stigma of being homeless when in fact the stated goal of the legislation is to make sure that people aren't treated with that stigma solely. And I understand that there's people who can be homeless that are unhoused, that could have co issues, but I've heard this discussion about how trying to fight stigma is actually going to hurt people who are being stigmatized already. And I love, can you follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're gonna put this really bluntly, 5 years in, I'm just going more blunt. You're to some extent gonna make certain people in the population seem radioactive. And I think that you're gonna have business owners who are, for many of the co-presenting issues associated with this person being unhoused, are going to, say, please leave my business. Please, leave my stoop. And I think in these instances, they're well suited, but now there's this private right of action for these big activities that, folks will be concerned that if they are, trying to apply a reasonable, protection of their place of public accommodation of the customers, of their employees, they're going to be seen as discriminatory because of this new vague legislation. I think I think, again, this will just send the wrong message to folks. It'll send the message to the folks, frankly, unhoused. Settle in. We're not doing anything to house you. We're just going to make it easier for you to live in tents and on the streets. And it'll send the message to community members, be careful what you do or say around these folks. I know it's already tough. I already know that you have the best intentions, but if you make any mistake, I hope your insurance is good because you're facing a private right of action. And guess what? We can't even explain exactly what is being protected.
Representative Elder.
Thanks. Well, I think that's an important question, Chair Stevens asked, because of course it is the intention to protect from stigma. And I'm someone who's raised this before as well. So I'm happy to try to articulate what I mean by it. I think that there is, because I generally agree with Austin's, a lot of Austin's points on those lines. I think there is a lack of understanding of our housing crisis right now. I think there's a lack of understanding of our drug crisis. I think, for example, a lot of people don't realize that when we're talking about fentanyl, that it's not like something that's polluting the heroin supply. There is no heroin supply. That doesn't really have to do with this conversation, but that's like a baseline fact. I think a lot of people, it's hard to catch up. It's hard to catch up in this moment. I don't think people realize until they read the article about 60 families being turned away every day, exactly the nature of our twin crises. And while that's happening, there is what I see, a large degree of conflation between the two. So I think a lot of people are seeing, here is the person using drugs publicly, they must be unhoused. And a lot of people saying, and we know we've heard this, I've heard it on the floor, people who are chronically in these extended Motel GA programs must be drug users. That conflation is dangerous. And that is what I am afraid of with the stigma, is that in this lack of well-defined crises, that the metastasizing of these parallel crises is awful. But I think at a certain point, we have to say there's a lack of good information and we have to be careful because they're not the same issue.
Yeah.
They're a Venn diagram that overlaps. They can reinforce each other. They are separate. You know, the xylazine drug use thing, it is a crime being perpetrated upon this country and upon our people. And I'll leave it at that for now. The homelessness is a systemic problem and the two are exacerbating each other. But to wed them too closely together in our own official narratives, I think is really worries me. So,
and I don't think I can understand, I agree with everything that's just said. I don't think I can understate enough how difficult it is for members of our community who have places of public accommodation to try to deal with this. They're, out there using Narcan on individuals who are passing out, by their dumpsters or in their businesses. And then I don't know if you've ever Narcan someone, but they don't wake up happy. They wake up angry. They wake up angry that you ruined their high. And fentanyl is so strong that they now need to go immediately and find more fentanyl. We used to have with heroin, actually seems easy to deal with compared to fentanyl. You'd have a long period of someone drying out, and then in that time people could intervene and try to get help. Fentanyl is just this quick ride up and down where folks immediately need to find more fentanyl, and the withdrawal symptoms are much worse and it's much cheaper. And folks are trying their best to be, folks are being empathetic. Folks are working really hard to be empathetic. They're concerned. Like I said, they're getting advice that's conflicting from government bodies. They're doing everything they can to be empathetic, good neighbors to the folks who are unhoused or the folks who are perceived as unhoused, but are dealing with other issues. And they're feeling like no matter what they do, it's wrong. And they're going to take this. They're going to take this as, whatever you do is wrong again. And now you're getting sued for it. It does send the wrong message at the wrong time. I can't underscore that enough. And if we want to talk about discrimination, let's talk about 50 years of discriminatory land use policy in this state.
well, we are.
That's
we
the discrimination that's tearing our communities apart. That's what's made us have a chronic lack of housing in the state that is resulted in our homelessness crisis. Because at its root, homelessness is a lack of housing. We lack 6,000 units right now.
So that leads me to this question. And I hear your opposition and the association's opposition to the Bill of Rights. And I think that's where most of this conversation has been about the difficulty in creating a relationship or culture where the struggles of each are what I hear is that your discussion is that the struggles of each are set against each other and that they're not going to work out, that the problem of homelessness is beyond poverty is, of course, available housing. So let's go there for a minute. Second half of the bill proposes to insert language into our anti-discrimination laws where someone cannot be if someone who is unhoused is seeking work, seeking an apartment, is seeking other issues where this is inserted, that they can't be discriminated against for that reason, among many others. Is there opposition to inserting that language into our, and defining that if someone is unhoused, that they can't be discriminated against simply because they are unhoused in a way that's different than saying, I can't rent this apartment to everybody, so therefore everybody can't get this apartment. But if it's if people are singled out for particular reasons, that's what anti-discrimination law is about, is for particular reasons. Would the chamber your businesses be opposed to addressing the lack of housing and the difficulties for people to get housing, and put them in the pool with everyone else to say, in these difficult times, you can't discriminate against people who are identifying themselves as unhoused?
I think we've spent so much time on that first, but we never really got to shoot through the second bit that you're talking about. And I think that that's a complicated section. And I first, is there evidence that we need that? I mean, I certainly have employers that I've worked with who have employees who are unhoused, and they have moved mountains, frankly, to help these employees. They've provided a place for individuals to shower before shifts and store things because they don't frankly have places to store things, and helped them with financial literacy. HR directors helping employees open bank accounts, bringing in programs such as the Working Bridges and, other employment coaches who can help individuals navigate things that might be simple to us: credit scores, filing taxes, getting driver's licenses. I think I don't like the prospect of this because it is kind of saying that employers discriminate. Like it's implying that that's happening. Employers are discriminating on the basis of being housed, when in all of my experience, quite the opposite is happening. Employers are pulling people to prosperity and working very hard. And then if we want to look at this from a purely just harsh economic reality, right now in our county, unemployment rate is 1.7%. Across the state, we're still barely touching 2%. So if every single individual on unemployment took 3 full-time jobs, we still want to be able to touch the 23,000 person gap we have in employment. So employers are doing whatever they can to bring anyone in who can work. And they're starting them at wages that are much higher than we ever could have imagined when I first started this job, and folks were talking about a minimum wage of $15. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is, I don't know if there's a need for this. And I think it, again, sends the wrong message. And then in terms of housing, there is a critical lack of housing stock. And when you have a small supply, folks are going to try to have, pre-qualifications for folks to have that housing. That's going to certainly make it harder. And I think the answer is not to say we're upset with you for wanting to see previous references for rental history or all these things that a lot of landlords do. And I think you should talk to the Landlords Association on this. But I think the more important thing would be to say, we're going to build housing. We're going to create pathways out of homelessness and that are accommodating of these factors. We're going to work, and I think we've done that in this building. There's certainly the VHIP program is a great example of getting private landlords to invest capital in derelict properties that can then serve people exiting homelessness. I think that there's plenty of ways we've gone at this. I don't understand why we're inviting more lawyers to the party to get them their share of business in potential suits like this.
One last question from Representative Burrows.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. When you talk about your employers helping their employees with their credit scores, their driver's licenses, their bank accounts, that would imply that all of those employees have homes, because all those things that you just mentioned are areas where people without homes are discriminated against, either intentionally or unintentionally. That is what the second half of the law seeks to remediate.
I'm not sure if I follow because
And secondly, last year, and it stuck with me, it did stick with me. You said that 80% of your members are businesses where at least a percentage of the employees receive state funding for state benefits. And I wondered, when you say that your employers are paying higher than normal wages, it still doesn't get the employees over the threshold for the basic needs budget. So how is it that they're paying higher than normal wages, but they're still receiving state benefits?
I'm gonna start with the second one, because I think what you're referring to is that we had, and I don't know if it was 80, we had a high number of employers report that they had employees have trepidation or potentially not move forward with a raise or promotion out of fear of it having a disproportional impact on state benefits. Now, state
Right.
benefits don't necessarily mean social services. That could be CCFAP, that could be, a whole host of other things. Like most primarily, the benefits cliff, I think, lives the most for childcare subsidies for a lot of families. So I don't think it's necessarily, and I think the other thing would be just the fact that folks are afraid of that doesn't imply it's happening to all of them. There's a perception for most people, especially people who are in the midst or have climbed their way out of poverty, that they are potentially hitting benefit cliffs. Benefit cliffs are very traumatic events for most people who've ever experienced them. And therefore, it's something that sticks with people. And it has them always kind of live in a slight fear that anything they do to advance themselves will be met with a disproportional clawback of assistance they're receiving. On the first point you made, I'm not too sure, and maybe you want to re-explain it, just because individuals who are unhoused can still have bank accounts or driver's licenses. They certainly still exist in systems that give credit scores. The fact that a person is unhoused does not necessarily mean that the person is not living in systems. It just means that they have a harder time doing it. And I can say that from, even some personal experience, but that goes back to what we talked about years ago, and we kind of have left that discussion point behind because we've just gone through this so many times and there's other issues of importance. But you're kind of underlining the temporal status of housing status and how interesting that is to put that in a protected class when it's something that could change from week to week.
Well, I was actually just going on the testimony that we heard yesterday during the homelessness Awareness Day about, when we heard, people with lived experience talking about, having difficulty getting identification and post office box and, bank accounts because they don't have addresses.
Well, it certainly is more difficult, and that's why employers are helping them, helping people do that. That's why, I mean, that's a lot of the work of helping someone right a ship when they're on out, certainly.
So you think it should be voluntary for employers and that the problem should be solved voluntarily by employers helping employees versus people without homes having the ability on their own to pursue those?
I'm not sure, this isn't, the passage of this bill will, I'm not sure if you're conflating two things as being one and the same. Right now, employers are helping. This bill is implying that right now employers are discriminating on these bases.
Well, it's both, right? Some of your members are helping, but I think you are implying, what I'm hearing you imply is that we should leave it to employers to help employees, despite the fact that we have people who aren't
I'd
employed.
actually love it if my employers could do the things they're good at and, make widgets and serve people food and things like that and not have to be picking up the slack for a failed system. I would love that. I think, we have that in a lot of situations, I think there's conversation around like, why are employers starting childhood centers? Why aren't employers providing housing? Why aren't employers doing this? And it's like,
But when.
because that's not what they do. They
Okay.
got into a business to make something they're good at, and now they're being tasked with solving all of society's shortcomings.
And that's the
Shortcomings
point.
that stem back to years of neglect from, this very institution.
But
All right, I'm sorry.
And this bill won't take.
I'm gonna, respectful, I'm just gonna stop right here. We have to get on the floor. So, thank you for coming in, sharing your thoughts, and we'll be bringing this bill up later.